November 22nd, 1942. A radio message arrives at the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's headquarters deep in the East Prussian forest. It comes from General Friedrich Paulus, commander of the German Sixth Army. The message is short, desperate, and terrifyingly clear. It says that Soviet forces have met at the town of Kalach. The pincers have closed. The Sixth Army, the pride of the Wehrmacht, the conquerors of France, the spearhead of the Eastern Front, is completely surrounded. For months, the German High Command had been fixated on taking the city of Stalingrad. They had poured everything into it. They had bled their divisions white for a few hundred yards of rubble. And now, in the span of just 4 days, the impossible has happened. 250,000 German soldiers, along with thousands of Romanians and auxiliaries, are trapped in a pocket of land that is rapidly shrinking. When this message arrived, the room at headquarters didn't explode into chaos immediately. Instead, there was a stunned, almost paralyzed disbelief. You have to understand that up until this moment, the German military machine had never suffered a disaster of this scale. They had been stopped at Moscow, yes. They had faced winter crises, but to have an entire field army, 250,000 men, cut off in a single stroke, it didn't fit their reality. Before we go into next, I want to ask you to subscribe right now and become a member of this channel. Do it so you never miss moments like this. Moments where we tell the truth in a calm, clear way. If 1,000 of you are watching, I hope all thousands of you join us. Because this community is growing and your presence truly matters here. So, and what the German High Command said next, specifically what Hitler and his inner circle decided in those first critical hours, sealed the fate of every man in that pocket. They didn't order a breakout. They didn't admit defeat. Instead, they retreated into a fantasy world of maps and markers that no longer matched the ground. Hitler looked at the map, saw the circle around Stalingrad, and said something that would haunt the German military for the rest of the war. He didn't see a trap. He saw a fortress. In this video, we are going to take you inside the Wolf's Lair and the headquarters of the Sixth Army. You will hear the exact words spoken by the generals who saw the disaster coming and the dictator who refused to believe them. You will see how a mix of arrogance, fear, and delusion turned a tactical defeat into a catastrophe that broke the back of the Third Reich. But to understand the shock of that telegram on November 22nd, you first need to understand the dangerous silence that came before it. To really grasp why the encirclement was such a shock, you have to look at the atmosphere in the German High Command just 2 weeks earlier. It was early November 1942. On the surface, the Germans seemed to be winning. In Stalingrad, they controlled 90% of the city. They had pushed the Soviet defenders to the very edge of the Volga River. The daily reports going back to Germany were all about street corners captured, factories taken, and enemy body counts. Hitler was convinced the Red Army was finished. He had actually stated in a speech in Munich just days before the Soviet counterattack that no power on earth will get us out of Stalingrad. This wasn't just propaganda. He believed it. He believed the Russians had no reserves left. He thought they were throwing the last of their strength into holding the city ruins. But there was a problem. One that General Kurt Zeitzler, the chief of the Army General Staff, tried repeatedly to point out. To keep pushing into the city, the Germans had stripped their flanks. The Sixth Army was like a fist punching forward, but the arm connecting that fist to the main body was dangerously thin. The flanks were guarded not by German panzer divisions, but by Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian troops. These allies were brave, but they were poorly equipped, lacked heavy anti-tank guns, and were stretched over hundreds of miles of open steppe. Zeitzler warned Hitler. He pointed to the maps. He showed the massive buildup of Soviet forces opposite those weak flanks. Soviet radio traffic had gone silent, a classic sign of an impending offensive. But the High Command, infected by Hitler's optimism, dismissed it. They called the Soviet buildup local reserves. They couldn't imagine the Soviets had the capacity to launch a massive pincer movement. They thought the Russians were just as exhausted as they were. Imagine being a staff officer in those days. You see the red arrows on the intelligence maps growing larger every day, pointing right at the Romanian sectors. You try to raise the alarm, and you are told you are being a defeatist. You are told the Russians are dead. The blindness was total. They were looking at the city, obsessed with the rat war in the sewers and cellars, completely ignoring the hammer that was raised over their heads, ready to smash down. And when that hammer finally fell, the sound was deafening. The silence ended at dawn on November 19th, 1942. It didn't end with a radio message, but with the roar of 3,500 Soviet guns and mortars, tearing apart the morning fog. This was the start of Operation Uranus. The Soviet plan was simple and brutal. They didn't attack the German Sixth Army in the city directly. They attacked the weak Romanian forces to the north and south of it. When the reports started reaching Army Group B headquarters, the tone was initially one of annoyance rather than panic. Heavy artillery fire reported in the Romanian sector. The logs read. The German commanders thought, okay, another local counterattack. We'll plug the line and move on. But within hours, that annoyance turned to cold fear. The Romanian Third Army to the north didn't just bend, it disintegrated. Soviet T-34 tanks were simply driving over the Romanian positions. The Romanian anti-tank guns, mostly 37mm knockoffs, were bouncing shells off the Soviet armor like hail off a tin roof. By midday, reports were flooding in that Soviet tank columns were 20, 30, 40 kilometers behind the front lines. General Paulus in Stalingrad was paralyzed. He had his eyes fixed on the city blocks ahead of him, and suddenly his rear echelon was collapsing. He asked for permission to release his reserve, the 48th Panzer Corps, to stop the breakthrough. But the orders from high command were confusing and delayed. When the panzers finally moved, they were caught in the open, outnumbered, and tangled with fleeing Romanian troops. It was chaos. The high command in East Prussia was struggling to catch up with reality. They were moving flags on a map representing divisions that effectively no longer existed. They were issuing orders to restore the line to commanders who were currently running for their lives. But the real shock came the next day, November 20th, when the second pincer launched from the south. Now, it wasn't just a breakthrough, it was a race. Two massive Soviet armored spearheads were racing toward the town of Kalach, directly behind the Sixth Army. And the Germans had nothing left to stop them. By November 22nd, the trap had snapped shut. Soviet tanks from the north and south met at the bridge at Kalach. It was a masterpiece of military planning, executed with a speed that the German high command thought the Soviets were incapable of. This is the moment where the psychology of the leadership becomes the most critical factor. General Paulus knew he was surrounded. His corps commanders knew it. General Seydlitz-Kurzbach, one of his most aggressive commanders, didn't wait for orders. He immediately argued that they had to turn around and break out. We must abandon Stalingrad, he said. We must punch through to the west before the Soviet ring hardens. Paulus sent a message to Army Group B and then to Hitler. The language was careful, professional military German, but the meaning was screaming off the page. He reported that his supply lines were cut. He reported that he had almost no fuel. He requested freedom of action, military code for permission to retreat. He knew that every hour they sat in the pocket, the Soviets were digging in, building a wall around them. At this exact moment, the German high command had a choice. They could admit that the strategy had failed. They could order a breakout, save the 250,000 men, regroup, and stabilize the front. It would mean giving up the city of Stalingrad, the city that bore the name of their enemy, the city Hitler had promised never to leave. Or they could double down. The atmosphere at the Wolf's Lair was electric with tension. General Zeitzler argued passionately for a breakout. He told Hitler, "The Sixth Army is doomed if it stays." But Hitler looked at the map. He looked at the vast space of the Russian steppe. And he retreated into his memories of the previous winter, where he had ordered troops to stand fast and they had survived. He thought he could do it again. He needed a reason to say no to Paulus. And tragically, he found one. But it didn't come from the army. It came from the sky. The decision that killed the Sixth Army happened in a room hundreds of miles away from the freezing steppe. It happened because of a question Hitler asked Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe. Hitler was looking for a way out of the political humiliation of retreating. He turned to Göring and asked, "Can you supply the Sixth Army by air?" Now, you have to understand the logistics here. The Sixth Army needed roughly 700 tons of supplies every single day, just to survive, food, fuel, and ammunition. That is a massive amount of cargo. The Luftwaffe barely had enough transport planes to move a fraction of that, and the weather was turning into a brutal Russian winter. Any competent logistics officer would have said, "No, mein Führer, it is impossible." The Luftwaffe's own Chief of Staff, Hans Jeschneck, knew it was impossible. But Göring was a man who lived on bravado and feared losing his standing with Hitler more than he feared losing soldiers. He wanted to regain his prestige after failing to stop the Allied bombings of German cities. So Göring puffed out his chest and made a promise that was a death sentence. He said the Luftwaffe will do it. This was the lie Hitler needed. He grabbed onto it with both hands. If the Air Force could supply the Army, then the Army didn't need to break out. They could stay right where they were. They could form a Fortress Stalingrad, tie down Soviet troops, and wait for a relief force to break through to them later. It turned a military disaster into a heroic stand, at least in Hitler's mind, so the order went back to Paulus. It was an order that stunned the generals in the pocket. The Sixth Army will form a hedgehog defense. You are to stand fast. Supplies are coming by air. When Paulus read this, he must have looked out at the bleak, snow-covered steppe and known deep down that it was a lie. But he was a staff officer, a man who followed orders. He didn't rebel. He didn't order the breakout on his own authority. He obeyed. And with that obedience, the steel door of the trap was welded shut. The reality of the airlift shattered the illusion almost immediately. Remember, the promise was 500 to 700 tons of supplies a day. That is what the mathematicians and logistics experts told High Command was the absolute minimum to keep 250,000 men from freezing or starving. But what the pilots faced was a nightmare that no chart in Berlin could account for. When the airlift began, the weather turned catastrophic. Blizzards grounded planes for days. When they did fly, they were flying into a wall of Soviet anti-aircraft fire. The Russians knew exactly where the planes had to land, at the Potomnik and Gumrak airfields inside the pocket. They lined the approach corridors with flak guns and fighter planes. It was a turkey shoot. Back at Wolf's lair, the reports coming in were grim, but they were often filtered before reaching Hitler. The average delivery wasn't 700 tons. It wasn't even 300. It was barely 90 tons a day. Imagine that. Less than 15% of the minimum requirement. And sometimes, the disconnect between High Command and the front was so severe, it was grotesque. One day, a plane landed braving heavy fire, and instead of unloading ammunition or food, the soldiers found crates of pepper and marjoram. Another plane brought thousands of right-footed boots, but no left ones. The soldiers in the Kessel, the cauldron, started to realize they had been betrayed. They were hacking frozen horse meat out of the ice with bayonets. They were counting their remaining bullets. But the messages coming from High Command continued to be delusional. They spoke of heroic endurance and vital contributions. They were treating the Sixth Army like a strategic chess piece that was holding its square, refusing to acknowledge that the piece was slowly dying. General Richthofen, the Luftwaffe commander on the scene, was screaming down the phone lines to headquarters. He told them, "The airlift is a lie. We are killing the army." But in the conference rooms, Göring kept making excuses, and Hitler kept pointing to the map, convinced that willpower alone could fly planes through a blizzard. They were buying time, but they were paying for it with the lives of thousands of men every single day. With the airlift failing, the only hope left was a relief force breaking in from the outside. This task fell to Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, perhaps the most brilliant operational mind the Germans had. He organized Operation Winter Storm in December 1942. The plan was for the 4th Panzer Army to punch through the Soviet ring and open a corridor to the 6th Army. This created the most agonizing dilemma of the entire battle. As Manstein's tanks fought their way toward Stalingrad, they could actually see the flashes of the artillery fire from the pocket on the night horizon. They got within 30 miles. 30 miles. That is a day's march. Manstein sent messages to Paulus. "Don't wait. Break out now. Meet me halfway." This was the moment of truth. If Paulus ignored Hitler's stand fast order and attacked westward to link up with Manstein, the army, or a large part of it, could be saved. But they would lose the city. They would lose all their heavy equipment. It would be a retreat. And Paulus, sitting in his freezing bunker, looked at the radio orders from Hitler that said, "Hold Stalingrad." The communication between the commanders during these days is heartbreaking. Manstein used the code word thunderclap to signal the breakout. He tried to give Paulus plausible deniability, arguing that it was the only tactical option. But Paulus was paralyzed by his loyalty to the chain of command. He replied, "I cannot disobey the Führer." He cited his lack of fuel, saying his tanks only had enough gas for 20 kilometers, not 30. So the relief force stopped. The Soviet resistance stiffened. And slowly, Manstein's tanks had to turn back or risk being encircled themselves. The soldiers inside the pocket, who had been listening to the rumble of German guns getting closer, suddenly heard them getting fainter. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was the sound of hope leaving. The High Command had played its last card, and because of rigid adherence to orders and a dictator's refusal to admit a mistake, the door slammed shut forever. By Christmas 1942, the mood inside the Wolf's Lair and the mood inside Stalingrad were entire worlds apart. In the bunker, officers were now openly discussing suicide. The rations were down to a slice of bread a day. Typhus and dysentery were rampant. The fortress Stalingrad was really just a massive, freezing, open-air prison camp. But in East Prussia, the delusion persisted, though the tone had shifted. They were no longer talking about victory. They were talking about myth-making. Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, began to see the encirclement not as a military disaster to be fixed, but as a Wagnerian tragedy to be exploited. The message from High Command wasn't, "How do we save them?" anymore. It was, "How do we make their death useful?" The soldiers knew it. There is a famous story of a German doctor and artist, Kurt Ruber, who drew the Stalingrad Madonna on the back of a Soviet map during Christmas. It became an icon of the suffering. But look at the letters the soldiers were writing home. Letters that were flown out on the last planes. They weren't writing about victory. They were writing, "We have been written off. Don't look for us. The leadership has failed us." The Soviets, sensing the end, sent envoys to Paulus offering honorable surrender terms. They promised food, medical care, and safety for the officers. It was a generous offer, given the brutality of the Eastern Front. Paulus radioed Hitler, asking for permission to accept. The reply from High Command was instant and cold. Capitulation is out of the question. The army will hold its position to the last man and the last round. Think about that. Hitler knew they couldn't be saved. He knew they were starving. Yet he ordered them to die, fighting solely to tie down Soviet troops for a few weeks longer. He was spending the lives of 250,000 men like loose change. It was no longer war. It was a sacrifice. And the men in the ruins, wrapping rags around their frostbitten feet, realized that to their leader, they were more valuable dead than alive. The end came in late January 1943. The Soviets split the pocket in two. The last airfield fell, meaning no more supplies, no more letters out, no escape for the wounded. The Sixth Army was compressed into a few ruined city blocks. Paulus and his staff were trapped in the basement of the Univermag department store in the city center. On January 30th, the 10th anniversary of the Nazis coming to power, Hitler sent one final radio message to Paulus. It wasn't a plan. It wasn't encouragement. It was a promotion. Hitler promoted Friedrich Paulus to the rank of field marshal. Now you have to understand the code of the German military to understand what this really meant. In the history of Prussia and Germany, no field marshal had ever surrendered to the enemy. If a field marshal lost, he died fighting, or he took his own life. By promoting him, Hitler was handing Paulus a pistol and expecting him to use it. He wanted the headline, "Field Marshal dies heroically at Stalingrad." He wanted the martyr. When Paulus received the promotion, he reportedly looked at his staff and said, "I have no intention of shooting myself for this Bohemian corporal." It was the first and last act of rebellion from the man who had obeyed every disastrous order for months. The spell broke. The realization that Hitler cared more about the optics of his death than the reality of his life finally pushed Paulus over the edge. The next morning, January 31st, Soviet soldiers entered the basement. They found the newly minted field marshal lying on a camp bed, unshaven and exhausted. He didn't pull his pistol. He surrendered. When the news reached Hitler, he went into a rage. He wasn't angry about the loss of the army. He was angry that Paulus hadn't killed himself. He ranted to his staff. He could have freed himself from all sorrow and ascended into eternity and national immortality, but he prefers to go to Moscow. It was the ultimate proof that the High Command had completely detached from humanity. Of the 250,000 men trapped in the Stalingrad pocket, roughly 90,000 marched into Soviet captivity in the freezing cold of February 1943. The rest were dead, killed in action, starved, or frozen stiff in the ruins. But the tragedy didn't end with the surrender. Of those 90,000 prisoners, only 6,000 would ever see Germany again. Most died in gulags and labor camps. What the German High Command said, and what they refused to say during those critical months, changed the entire war. Their arrogance created the trap, their delusion sustained it, and their callousness ensured it was a total annihilation. Stalingrad wasn't just a military defeat. It was the moment the German army lost its soul and its belief in the infallibility of its leader. The myth of the invincible Wehrmacht was buried in the snow along the Volga. This moment reminds us that history is often shaped by the inability of powerful men to admit they are wrong. The Sixth Army didn't die because they couldn't fight. They died because their leaders couldn't face the truth. And as promised, I want to leave you with an image that sums this up. There is a photograph of Paulus walking into captivity, staring blankly ahead. But the real document of history is the final flight log of the Luftwaffe, showing planes leaving with wounded men, while thousands more reached up to the cargo doors, begging to be taken, only to be kicked back into the snow as the engines revved. That is the true legacy of the High Command's decisions. If you want to understand how the Soviets managed to pull off this deception and hide 1 million men right under Hitler's nose, you need to watch this video next on Soviet Maskirovka tactics. It explains the other side of this deadly coin.